Welcome to Mikhail Zygar's book talk, War and Punishment, Putin, Zelensky, and the Path to Russia's Invasion of Ukraine. Here is the book. I am Elise Giuliano. I'm a senior lecturer at Harriman Institute at Columbia University. And I am also director of the master's program here in Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies, and director of the PER program, which stands for the Program on U.S.-Russian Relations, which is supported by a grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And we would like to thank Carnegie Corporation for their support this evening and making this event possible. And also a quick note of thanks before we get started to the staff that helped to organize this event, Eileen Hoon and Leo, the PER assistant, who is also a master's student in our program. Okay, so I will just tell you a little bit about how we will organize tonight's event. I'll start with by introducing our honored guests, and then I will turn the floor over to Mr. Zygar, who will talk, and then we will have some comments by our second speaker, who I will introduce right now. And then we will have a Q&A period. If you have a question, please hold it to the end. And when you pose your question, just please quickly introduce yourself. Okay, so I don't think that our guest needs much introduction, but he's very well known, and he's quite famous in Russia and around the world. But I will give you a little bit more information about his bio. He worked for Newsweek Russia and the Business Daily Commerçant, and covered conflicts in Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, Serbia, and Kosovo before becoming founding editor-in-chief of Dost, which was Russia's only independent television channel, and which I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but for those who are not, it provided an alternative to Kremlin-controlled federal TV channels and gave a platform to opposition voices before it was closed down by the Kremlin. He won the International Press Freedom Award in 2014, and he is also the author of All the Kremlin's Men, which was a #1 bestseller in Russia, and it has been translated into over 20 languages and was called one of 9 books that can help you understand Russia right now by Time magazine. And we also hosted a book talk several years ago for that book as well. We were very proud of that. He's also the author of The Empire Must Die, a Kirkus Review's best nonfiction book of the year. And I could go on, but I will now turn to introducing Joel Simon, who will offer some comments in a few minutes. He is the founding director of the Journalism Protection Initiative at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, which is part of CUNY, the City University of New York. He's the author of 4 books, including, most recently, The Infodemic: How Censorship and Lies Made the World Sicker and Less Free. That doesn't make them less valuable, and I can say that as an academic. At least we like to think that's the case. He writes regularly on press freedom issues for The New Yorker and produces a column for Columbia Journalism Review. From 2006 to 2021, he served as executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. And during 2022, he was fellow at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University and a senior visiting fellow at the Knight First Amendment Institute, also at Columbia. So welcome back. And let's just please join me in welcoming our speakers. And I will now turn the microphone over to Mr. Zygar.
Thanks so much. Thank you for the introduction. I think I needed to start with explaining why I wrote this book and why I felt that it was right. It was necessary to write this book after the aggression against Ukraine started in February 24th of the last year. My book starts with very provocative words. I write that this book is a confession, and I need to admit that I'm guilty as well for this war, as I think that a lot of my predecessors, Russian writers, Russian intellectuals, Russian journalists are also guilty for turning a blind eye to all the signs we should have noticed before. I think that we ignored the fact that for many centuries, Russian culture, Russian language, Russian literature was being used as a weapon against other cultures, against other nations which had been colonized by the Russian Empire. I think that we could have seen it before, but we were just distracted by other problems, and we failed to understand that crucially important problem. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, after 1991, there was a lot of intellectual work, a lot of attempt made to try to reconsider our approach to Soviet history, to Russian history. But a lot of Russian historians, Russian intellectuals, Russian journalists paid attention to denouncing of the Soviet period. They were extensively writing, extensively researching about Stalin's purges, about Lenin, about Bolsheviks, about the crimes of the Soviet Union. But they did nothing, unfortunately, to address the issue of the great Russian Empire. I'm a bit sarcastic when I pronounce the word great, because I think that that is a problem itself. For so many years, we've been calling ourselves great people. We've been calling Russian literature great Russian literature, great Russian language, great, everything was so great. A lot of Russian writers were praising ourselves for being unique people, people chosen by God, people with unique spirituality, or probably like Russian people are the guardians of the Christian spirituality, as now Vladimir Putin says. But that the same idea was spread and was maintained by Russian philosophers and Russian thinkers for several centuries, including Dostoevsky and other writers of the 19th century. So unfortunately, that idea that Russian Empire has always been a threat to its people, and that Russian Empire was a colonial empire that suppressed and colonized different nations, was overlooked and has never been raised after 1991, because addressing that issue might have undermined the idea of the existence of Russian Federation. That question was too hard to absorb and too hard to start the conversation about that. Unlike many other former empires, unlike British Empire, former German Empire, former Austrian Empire, even former Turkish Empire, Ottoman Empire, Russia has never started that conversation. Russia has never started any kind of attempt to reanalyze our imperial past, and Russian historians have never started writing another historical narrative. We don't have any other historical narrative except for traditional Russian imperial narrative. Unfortunately, it's very easy to notice that most of great Russian historians, all the creators of traditional Russian historical narrative, used to be propagandists. Legendary Karamzin was personally picked up by Alexander I and was appointed by Alexander I to write the history of Russian state, and he was reporting directly to the emperor. And that was a part of the tradition, how official historians worked with the power. His predecessors acted in the same way. Feofan Prokopovich, another historian and the man who who has invented the myth of Mazepa, for example, was appointed by Peter the Great, Peter the First, or in 20th century, academician Grekov, the person who almost invented the term Kievan Rus, and who spread the myth that Kievan Rus was a state, although the phrase itself was invented only in 19th century and was popularized in 20th century by Boris Grekov. That historian worked and was watched by Joseph Stalin, and he was reporting to him, and his position was very close to the Karamzin's one. He was also official historiographer of the Soviet Union, and he wrote that historical narrative that that was necessary for the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, we have never had a history of Russian people, and we have never had history of Russian peoples. We have never had a history of different nations which were occupied, colonized by the Russian Empire. Even more, the word colonies, the word colonization has always been a taboo for Russian historians. Any Russian historian would say that no. Colonial empire is British Empire. You should not call colonies all those parts of Mother Russia which are so close to us, like Siberia is not a colony. Colonies are something beyond the ocean. But actually, there is no difference between the methods how Northern America was colonized by the Englishmen and how Siberia was colonized by the Cossacks. And actually, even the time period was absolutely the same. The same years, the same methods, the same level of occupation, the same level of extermination of all those indigenous people. So I think we are now, after the war, the full-scale aggression against Ukraine started, we cannot ignore that fact that we were blind, and that's why we thought that we could afford to believe in those lies of traditional Russian historical narrative. And I think it's that aggression should be a wake-up call for us, and we should change our approach to Russian history. We should reconsider it, we should revise it, and we should start thinking of, we should start creating new historical narrative that is not submissive to the Russian state, that does not serve the interests of Russian emperors, presidents, or Vladimir Putin. I think we are right in the beginning of this process, and I consider my book to be like the first step in that direction. That's an invitation to my readers, to my colleagues, to other journalists and writers to start that conversation. That book is focused on the history of the relations between Russian Empire and Ukraine. It's not a history of Ukraine, but a history of Russia suppressing Ukraine, and it deals with most important historical myths, because unfortunately Russian history consists of a lot of myths people believe in. A lot of people are sincerely believing in those myths, including President Putin. So I've got 7 chapters about 7 most important myths of Russian history, and then 7 chapters about how all those myths are being used by Russian authorities right now, and how they are still alive, and how they influence minds of Russians today, how they influence the policy, and how they happen to influence the global audience. Because unfortunately, the Western historians, a lot of Western historians have been educated in the same tradition, the traditional Russian historical narrative that was part of the DNA of the white immigrants 100 years ago, the people who left Russia but still believed in a sacred great Russian Empire, united and indivisible. And all those people from white immigration, they spread their belief in the sacred Russian Empire to their Western colleagues. So we almost don't have any alternative historical narrative of Russian Empire in the West. So I think it's right time to go in that direction, not only for the Russians, but for the historians, political scientists, journalists in the West. That's the idea of my book. I would be happy to answer your questions. I think that that book could be some kind of provocation for a lot of Russians or Russian-speaking people all around the world. But first, I think the floor goes to Joel.
Unfortunately, before you get to ask your questions, you have to listen to me. So start thinking about your questions, because I know you're here to see Mikhail and to hear and to engage with him about this very wonderful and provocative book. But I want to say a few words that might help guide the conversation and put what I consider to be a remarkable achievement in a bit in some context. So, I mean, the first thing that I would say about this project and Mikhail's book and is that, you know, if you look obviously at what happened in Ukraine, and if you look more broadly at what's happening, you know, war is raging around the world, and that war is being fought over contested histories, right? And the battlefield is not just the physical battlefield, but it's also the information space. Now, I spent a quarter century at the Committee to Protect Journalists, and what I did there in good measure was to fight for the rights of journalists to be present on the front lines, to document the reality of war, to inform the world. And I did this because journalists have a fundamental right. This is a fundamental right guaranteed under international law to carry out this work. Of course, it's a right that is routinely violated. Combatants often tolerate the presence of journalists who reflect and amplify their own narrative, but they restrict, they limit, they censor, or they even kill journalists when they don't. Mikhail, having worked as a frontline reporter in an active conflict zone, I'm sure this is a reality you know well. But I feel that what Mikhail is doing with this book is he's performing a similar function, but on a different battlefield. He's described the book as a provocation. And what he's doing is he's challenging the Kremlin's history, their narrative, their version of history. And it's a history that is essential to the military project, to the invasion of Ukraine. But what's interesting about his role is that he's approaching this work not as a conventional historian. That's not what Mikhail is. He's a journalist, and he's applying a level of journalistic skepticism to the official history and exposing the lies and delusions. Now, today, I left the Committee to Protect Journalists a little more than a year ago. As I mentioned, I'm the director of the journalism program, the Journalism Protection Initiative at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. And of course, we're delighted to co-sponsor this evening's discussion. And we're also delighted that Mikhail has joined us as our inaugural Press Freedom Fellow. And we're grateful to the Knight Foundation for making that possible. And not long after Mikhail arrived in New York, I had the opportunity to sit down with him, and we've known each other for a while, but to sit down and actually interview him, which is always a strange experience when you know someone and you interview them, you actually learn some new things. So let me just read to you something he sent to me. So I asked him, about, kind of writing about history as a journalist, and I want to read to you what he told me. He said, I don't stop being a journalist, even when I'm writing books about history. I still have the same critical approach. I do not trust the official or the historical sources of the archives or the memoirs or anything without double checking. You do not consider the people who lived decades or centuries ago as monuments. You consider them as newsmakers, and you treat them as such. For me, there is no difference in how I treat Catherine the Great and how I treat Vladimir Putin. Now, during the time I spent at the Committee to Protect Journalists, I would make an annual visit to Russia each year to support independent media and demand that the government investigate the killing of journalists. And for many years, Russian journalists welcomed us. We would visit Echo Moskvy, we would visit Novaya Gazeta, Dmitry Muratov would take us out to dinner. We would meet with prosecutors who were supposed to be investigating these cases. We would meet with the top human rights official in Putin's government. And some of you may be surprised that such a person existed, but this was a different day and that there was such a person. One year we went and the Supreme Court actually hosted us, the entire delegation. They were very excited. They were like, oh, you defend journalists. There should be a committee to defend judges. That's a great idea. But anyway, the point is they welcomed us. There was some sort of official recognition of our role and tolerance for it. But as the space closed and the repression mounted, Russian journalists basically asked us to stop coming. They did this not because they didn't welcome and appreciate our concern, but because they believed that our visits would do more harm than good. Putin had become increasingly immune to international public opinion, and our visits actually just allowed the government to more easily paint the media, independent media, as quote unquote foreign agents. You know how that story played out. Now, obviously, after the invasion of Ukraine, the limited space for independent media, that door was slammed shut. Dmitry Muratov labeled the crackdown that followed the invasion as a kind of information genocide. But there is independent journalism happening in Russia. It's happened at great risk. It's isolated, it's under siege. And of course, there's independent media operating outside the country. There's Medusa, there's TV Rain, which of course continues to operate, which Mikhail helped found. Now, given this reality, I think Mikhail will be the first to acknowledge that he's fortunate and he's privileged. He's here in New York, he's valued, he's appreciated, he's even celebrated. But I think nonetheless, he's on the front lines. He's on the front lines of the information war. He's operating in the battle space where Putin has sought to construct the official narrative. Mikhail's not a partisan. He's a journalist. He's exposing the carnage. He's uncovering the lies. He's performing journalism's most essential role, applying skepticism and independence into a contested space in which combatants are fighting. I'm really, really glad to see that War and Punishment has found such a receptive audience in the United States and in Europe, where Mikhail just returned. He got a wonderful reception in Germany. That's so important. And the book is actually about to be published in Russian, which is huge. I can guarantee you that Vladimir Putin does not want the citizens of Russia to read this book. And because of official censorship and the structure of the media today in Russia, it will not be easy for them to do so. But let's hope it finds an audience, because if the citizens of Russia stop believing the myths that justified the attempted conquest of Ukraine, then their support for this terrible war with its immense human costs will wane. Thank you. Mikhail?
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, thank you for that context. That's very helpful. Could I ask you, Mikhail, to delve in a little more deeply to tell us a little bit about what some of those 7 myths of history that Putin uses to justify the war are, for those of you who haven't read the book, and to give us a kind of a more textured understanding of your arguments in the book.
Sure, absolutely. And actually, it's important that that all those myths were not created by Putin. They exist for some of them for 3 centuries already, and the first and probably one of the most important is the legendary reunification of Russia and Ukraine that happened in 17th century, and that was a very legendary milestone, especially celebrated during the Soviet period, when Bogdan Khmelnytsky, actually the founder of the first of the independent Ukrainian state in the 17th century, was created as some kind of Soviet icon and the symbol of the Russian-Ukrainian friendship. Almost no one knows that it has never been a reunification of Russia and Ukraine. It was just a contract between Cossacks and the ambassadors of Russian Tsar, and two sides considered it to be absolutely different things. For Cossacks in 17th century, that was quite natural to sign a contract with another state, as, for example, before that they had a contract with France and Cardinal Mazarin. But that myth is deeply rooted in our perception of Russian and Ukrainian history, and actually is completely wrong. The second one is connected with the name of Ivan Mazepa, who is a legendary figure who was Ukrainian hetman, and one of the successors of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and in the traditional Russian historical narrative, he is a traitor. He was during the part of his life being the ruler of Ukraine. He was loyal to Peter the Great, but then during the Great Northern War, he switched alliance and allied with Sweden, because actually the way Peter the Great treated Ukraine was really dangerous. And actually, according to Russian historical tradition, Mazepa is a traitor, and the person who codified that myth was the great Russian poet Alexander Pushkin. His famous, or maybe infamous, poem Poltava is the unique example of the propagandist poem. And according to approach of the Ukrainian historians, it's very important that Mazepa has never betrayed Ukrainian people, and he has always been very loyal to the interests of his people. And for example, I like to compare some stories from the Russian history to the same to the very similar cases from the history of other empires. For example, for me, the story of Mazepa and Peter the Great remind me a lot of the Scottish national heroes like William Wallace or Robert Bruce, who actually did the same. Robert Bruce, the greatest hero of the Scottish nation and the King of Scots, initially in the beginning of his life was loyal to the English crown, but then he changed his mind mainly under influence of William Wallace, and started fighting against English army, and he's not remembered as a criminal or traitor. He is remembered by both Scots and English people as the greatest hero of the Scottish nation. So it's interesting how different people can transform their approach to the history, and can or they stick to the same historical mythology that was created back in 18th century, like for Russia today and for Russian audience today. Mazepa is still a criminal and is still a traitor, as he was considered by Peter the Great 200 years ago. I'll continue quicker. The third myth is obviously Catherine the Great and Crimea becoming part of Russia and Novorossiya becoming a part of Russia, because it was Catherine the Great and Potemkin who famously conquered that parts of today's Ukraine. And actually, it's not very well-known story that she started that conquest under influence of Voltaire, who wanted Russia to be a great empire, and who wanted Catherine the Great to move Russian capital from St. Petersburg to Constantinople, because she hated Turks, and he wanted Ottoman Empire to be annihilated and to become part of Russia. The fourth myth, and very important one, is about Ukrainian language, and the central figure in that story of the 19th century is obviously Taras Shevchenko, who is the greatest Ukrainian poet, and it's very important and completely unknown to most Russians, at least, that in most of 19th century, Ukrainian language was completely banned in Ukraine, and there was no possibility to publish books in Ukrainian or to teach in schools. The myth number 5 is a notorious phrase by Vladimir Putin that Lenin invented Ukraine. He said that in his notorious address to the nation when he declared full-scale war against Ukraine. And actually, it's also a very important historical myth how independent Ukraine was created after the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, and how the independent Ukrainian People's Republic was founded. Myth number 6 is obviously Holodomor, one of the most politicized historical myths in the present. Not the most politicized, but one of the most controversial topics that has been the center of tensions between Russia and Ukraine during the last 20 years, at least, after the Orange Revolution. And the final myth is obviously the World War II and Stepan Bandera, who is a household name now. And let me finish that with a short story I've discovered when I was writing this book. I found out why Vladimir Putin hates Stepan Bandera that much, and where is the source of his where is the most reliable source of his profound knowledge about Bandera, Banderites, and Ukrainian nationalists. I'm not sure if anyone in this audience, but I think there are people in this audience who have heard the name of Yulian Semyonov. That is a writer, a very famous Soviet writer, probably the most popular writer in the Soviet Union. He was writing crime stories, detective novels. He was Russian, combine all of them. Jan Fleming, John le Carré, John Grisham. He was the most published author in the Soviet Union, and he has created Shtirlitz. He had a series of novels about a Soviet spy whose real name was Maxim Isayev, but he was spying on the Third Reich, and he was very successful because no one could detect him. The most legendary novel by Yulian Semyonov about Shtirlitz is called 17 Moments of Spring, and there is a very famous Soviet series about that. And we know from all Putin's interviews that Stirlitz was his most beloved character, and actually he was the source of his inspiration. Putin decided to become to go to apply for work in KGB because he was so charmed, he was so fascinated by that spy romanticism and by Stirlitz himself. And obviously he was reading every single novel written by Semyonov about Stirlitz, but no one knows what was the next novel written by Yulian Semyonov after he had written 17 Moments of Spring. And his next novel, also beloved novel of Vladimir Putin, was called The Third Card. And in that novel, the major villain was Stepan Bandera. And Stirlitz was fighting against Stepan Bandera. And it's really funny to read now all those texts of that novel that Putin was reading as a boy or as a young student, because it seems to me that when Russian propagandists like Dmitry Kiselyov or Vladimir Solovyov are cursing about Bandera and Banderites, they're just quoting Yulian Semyonov. He's a villain, he's a Nazi, he's fascist, he's insane, he's monster, he's the beast. And like obviously when you read that novel as a child, and you love that novel, and you love and you associate yourself with Stirlitz till the end of your days, you will hate such a villain as Bandera, and you will spread that knowledge. And now we see the consequences. And I guess Yulian Semyonov might have been very surprised if he knew what geopolitical catastrophe would be caused by his fiction. Thank you so much. That's one of the stories I discovered for this book.
Thank you so much. That's really fascinating. And that those comments really should give the audience a sense of some of the way the book is written that makes it really so engaging, and some of the aspects that I really found. And this is the way you interweave these moments from film or novels, sometimes just to kind of draw a parallel or inform your audience, but other times to suggest that, like with the Stirlitz story, that there's this kind of feckless, ignorant ruler there in Russia who is informed by various pop culture influences. And the other one I really liked was when you mentioned the film Love Actually, the British film, in which toward the end, Hugh Grant's character, who's playing the Prime Minister of England, I mean, you can tell the story better than I can, stands up to the US in the wake of the 9/11, was it?
That was before
the war in Iraq. Yeah.
The film Love Actually was released right after the beginning of the war, and that was the moment when actually the current anti-Americanism started, and a lot of people all around the world were really terrified with the beginning of the war, and the idea of intellectual criticism of American aggression against Iraq was very fashionable. So Hugh Grant, as British Prime Minister, makes a very passionate anti-American speech. And actually, if we compare it to the famous Munich speech by Vladimir Putin, they are very close.
That's really interesting when you get down to the language of the speech, and then you can really think about Putin as kind of like, well, he doesn't have an original idea in his head, but he can kind of copy and find something that resonates with him, with his stunted emotional development. So these kinds of moments in the book, I think, are really interesting. On top of course, the very important arguments about the 7 myths and the broader argument about Russian history. So, and the other thing I will just say about the historical part of the book, which is constitutes a quite large part of the book, is that Mr. Zygar is a comparative historian and really compares a lot of what's happening in medieval Russia or medieval, I don't know what to call, East Central Europe, medieval Ukraine and 17th century, 18th century Ukraine to world historical moments that are happening around the world, as his comments as his comparison to Scotland suggested. So these are kind of bonus aspects that I would, if you aren't already convinced about the importance of this book, this is something that should really convey to you that it's enjoyable to read and edifying and stimulating as well. So I guess before we open to a question and answer period, I wanted to just ask one question, and this is kind of maybe not totally fair because it's from your interview on NPR where you said that you about the kind of the depth of beliefs among Russians in these historical myths. You said in a recent interview that everyone absolutely, in Russia has been raised on these myths. They've been taught a certain kind of history, and yet you sort of hope that or you see possibly that maybe not all of them have taken root so deeply. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about whether you see, whether you feel like there's something specific happening within the elites or possibly within the generation of Soviet-raised elites that surround Putin, and then possibly the next generation. Were they especially exposed to certain kinds of education? And do you feel, just as a Russian citizen, that maybe there would be a space for ordinary Russians not being completely convinced by the historical? I mean, this is a very general question because, of course, you show it's not just about the history, it's also about the claims of orthodoxy and Russian culture and great, and so on. So it's hard to sort of disentangle all of those elements. But in terms of maybe if you could just think about the history and the historical myths, do you see any kind of light or distance between what's happening among a kind of government elites or educated elites and then ordinary people? And then my part two question would be the way, as Americans, we're very aware of social hierarchy and ethnic hierarchy and racial hierarchy, right? Because we're a very multicultural society. And I always think that this is, something that exists in Russia as well, among ethnic groups and ethnic minorities and different peoples or nations. And I wonder, we don't always talk about it overtly, but the fact is that in the social hierarchy inherited from the Soviet period and one that persists, Russians are at the top and Ukrainians, are below, and then comes other ethnic groups and so on. And I just wondered if you feel like, despite all of the myths and the ideas of brotherhood and cultural similarity, that these kind of attitudes toward Ukrainians among Russians is something that has allowed the violence against them, allowed them to justify to themselves the violence against them, or a way that fed into them seeing as Ukrainians as others. And I would just welcome your musings on this topic, because in a way, just thinking about that quote, I mean, the joke of Zelensky in the book that you mentioned way before the war, when he's a comedian in the early days, and he has a kind of joke in which he says, like, well, Ukrainians have already conquered Russia. You just have to go to Tverskaya because there's Ukrainian prostitutes, that kind of thing. Or, the fact that a lot of the socioeconomic problems in Ukraine were even more dire than Russia in the early 1990s and for most of the 90s. And then you had like a lot of Ukrainian cleaning ladies in Moscow, these kinds of things that people don't talk about, that people don't necessarily want to face, but they're there and they're part of the culture. And so I just wanted to throw that out there and ask it whether you see any kind of change or shift, or just your thoughts on social hierarchy, because for political scientists and sociologists, it's a very important aspect of how we can understand how politicians can successfully demonize and create an other when there's a baseline kind of ethnic hierarchy.
These are a lot of very difficult questions. Thank you, and I'll try to take them one by one. I think that the perception of Ukraine has been changing, and all the prejudice that Russians have, Russian political elite has always had against other nations, that's a subject to change. We know that, for example, 100 years ago, a Russian historian who also happened to be the foreign minister in the provisional government, Pavel Milyukov, who was the leader of the liberal, of the most liberal party in the Russian Empire, and during the short period of the democratic Russia, he said that Russian liberal ends when the Ukrainian question starts. For Russian liberals in the beginning of 20th century, the idea of independent Ukraine was unimaginable. Everyone were 100% sure that Ukraine was inseparable part of Russia. But also I must remember that the same Milyukov thought that Bosporus and Dardanelles should be part of Russia, and that Constantinople should be the Russian city. And he thought that the real Russian interest in the First World War was conquering Constantinople. As well, Dostoevsky thought the same way, and we find those fantasies about Orthodox Constantinople in a lot of works of great Russian philosophers and writers of the 19th century and of the beginning of the 20th century. So we've come a long way. Now we see that Russian liberals, not to mention even Russian jingoists, Russian patriots, do not want to conquer Turkey. There is a change. In the 19th century, the role that Ukraine plays for many Russians was occupied by Poland, because the whole 19th century Russian Empire was fiercely fighting against Poland. That was a part of Russian Empire that was considered an inseparable province. And we remember Alexander Pushkin's poem To the Slanderers of Russia, where he calls the war between, like, the Russian army trying to suppress the Polish rebellion, the inner quarrel between Slavic nations. So he wanted to prove to the Europeans that they should not interfere into our internal Slavic affairs, because Poland is our internal issue. Actually 100 years, and no one considers Poland to be part of Russia, not to mention Finland. No one considers Finland to be part of Russia. So I guess we need some time to pass. And I'm 100% sure that the next generation of Russians won't consider Ukraine to be an inseparable part of Mother Russia. The history is very painful, and sometimes it's very close to to other histories of other empires. Sometimes it's different. We know that Ukrainians were ethnic minorities in two European empires, in the Austrian Empire and in the Russian Empire, and the treatment of Ukrainians were different. In Austrian Empire, for example, Ukrainians were considered to be, like, politically as a second-class citizens. They could have never achieved the high position in the government. They could not be treated as established politicians in Vienna, but they were not suppressed as an ethnic minority. They could speak their language. There were Ukrainian books published in Austria, and that was the paradox, because Ukrainian nation was split between Russian Empire and Austrian Empire, and most writers lived in the west, in the eastern part, in the Russian part of Ukraine. But all the possibilities to publish the books, all the schools and universities were in the western part, in the Austrian part, and that that division helped to create the unique phenomena of Ukrainian unity between Ukrainians from the East and Ukrainians from the West, because Ukrainians from Russian Empire wrote like Shevchenko, Khrushchevsky, or Kostomarov, or many others published their books in the West. So, and actually the approach to Ukrainians in the Russian Empire was absolutely different from the Austrian approach. In Russia, Ukrainians could reach any position. Many of them became ministers. The prime minister, the chancellor of Russian Empire under Catherine the Great, Prince Bezborodko, was Ukrainian. A lot of like the husband of the informal husband of Empress Elizaveta was Ukrainian. A lot of very prominent politicians in Russian Empire and then in the Soviet Union came from Ukraine, as Khrushchev and Brezhnev spent most of their lives in Ukraine. But there was very significant difference. To become a well-known prominent politician, bureaucrat, they must have abandoned their ethnic background. They should stop speaking Ukrainian, and there was no possibility to identify themselves as Ukrainians. They should have been Russified. They needed to start speaking Russian and to start thinking Russian, and that was the ticket. And the same thing happened to a lot of Ukrainian cultural figures, and the most famous is Nikolai Gogol, the person who spoke Ukrainian before he came to St. Petersburg, but he wanted a career. He adored Pushkin. He wanted to get acquainted to Pushkin, and he came to St. Petersburg, and he saw a lot of people, a lot of his compatriots who were ashamed of their Ukrainian accent, of their Ukrainian language, and all of them stopped speaking Ukrainian in St. Petersburg, and he did the same. He started writing only in Russian. He has never written anything in Ukrainian, because that was the only possibility to become famous. And actually, that's important, that Taras Shevchenko, who lived approximately the same time, did quite the opposite. He started writing in Ukrainian, and he was smashed by literary critics. If we now read what the greatest Russian critic of the 19th century, Belinsky, wrote about Shevchenko writing in Ukrainian, that's a disgrace. That's just, I'm ashamed of the fact that I have read that. That's terrible. But unfortunately, that was the way how Ukrainians were treated for centuries. They were not. They could speak Ukrainian and stay in the village, or to be promoted, they needed to be Russified, and that was the important phenomena. So. Is it a part of it's a special phenomena for the hierarchy of the Russian Empire or Soviet Empire? So they could have become prominent Russians. There were no obstacles, but only Russians. And the last question we're asking.
I guess I was just asking, what you think after 1991, the kind of economic dislocation and the difficulty that a lot of Ukrainians experience is something that we also fed into the social, ongoing, centuries-long social hierarchy in which Ukrainians, although they're at the top of a broader ethnic pyramid within Russia, within the Soviet period, after the collapse of the Soviet period, this kind of, at least for some Ukrainians, right, because many poor Russians as well, but
Yeah,
especially those went to Moscow as
I
secondary
got it.
status.
There was a very important, a very visible evolution of how Ukrainians changed the way how they treated themselves, and the way how what they thought about themselves, and how Russians changed their perception of Russian nation and of Ukrainian nation. For many people, for many Russians, the perception of Ukrainians has never changed, because they have that stereotype that there is no difference. Because as a tourist, when you are coming to Kiev and you see a lot of people, almost everyone speaking Russian, you see no obvious reason. That was the same stereotype Russian political elite has always had. Like Putin has always seen only proofs that there is no difference between Russians and Ukrainians. Probably there is only one. Ukrainians are very unreliable in business. Like that was his stereotype, that they are they like to steal money and to break their promises. That was like his own own stereotype. Probably that was connected to the fact that the people he dealt with were specific ones, like Medvedchuk or Yulia Tymoshenko or Petro Poroshenko were cunning Ukrainian businessmen with Soviet background. Like they spent most of their lives in the Soviet Union. They knew the way how to treat the bosses from Moscow. They knew that some tricks are needed. But it's very important that during after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian people have lived through the certain evolution, and the new generations of Ukrainians stopped considering themselves to be Soviet people, to be people living in the Russian colony. And it's a very important transformation that I describe in my book. And the most important example is Vladimir Zelensky himself. He is the first post-Soviet generation of Ukrainians. He was born in the Soviet Union. He was Oktyabryonak and then young pioneer, but he has never become a member of Komsomol, and he has never become a member of Communist Party. As a stand-up comedian, he started his career in Moscow, and he wanted to go to Moscow because in the beginning, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as in Chekhov's Three Sisters, everyone wanted to go to Moscow. That was the part that was the center of the Soviet civilization. And during the first years, it was obvious that, like, to be successful, everyone should speak Russian and go to Moscow. And it's very significant that it was his choice. After several very successful years in Moscow, he decided to come back. He decided voluntarily to go back to Kiev because he changed his approach, and it's very symbolic that he's coming back to from Moscow to Ukraine in 2003, and actually that's the symbolic year when the same transformation is starting for the whole Ukrainian nation. And we see the Orange Revolution in 2004, and that's like a very important psychological shift. And then that psychological shift continues, and the younger generations of Ukrainians are not post-Soviet people. They are inspired by another historical myths. For them, Zaporizhian host is probably that's also a historical myth, but the new Ukrainian perception of history and new Ukrainian education is based on that myth. And it's very symbolic that Russian historical narrative is still based on the Russian Empire, and there is an emperor on top. And Ukrainian historical myth is based on the almost almost militant democracy. There is no vertical of power. There is no dictator. There are Ukrainian Cossacks fighting for their own ways of thinking and living. And as a historical example, that's completely different from the traditional Russian narrative. And the new generations of Ukrainians, they depart from the traditional way of thinking. And we see that on the example of Zelensky, because the way how he jokes in the beginning of his career is absolutely unimaginable right now, because everything he says in the beginning of the century, like, it's outrageous for today. It's so insulting. He uses H word that is completely forbidden by Facebook or by any social media now, but it's okay for him as a Ukrainian to call himself and his compatriots with the worst word in Russian language, and then he changes completely along the way together with the Ukrainians, and he's not the only one. The fact that he's got that transformation and that he ends up being elected as a president symbolizes that the same transformation happened with the whole Ukrainian society. They do not consider themselves to be the colony, and that's some gap between the Russian way of thinking of Russia and of Ukraine and the Ukrainian way of thinking of themselves. It's a gap that has to be that is widening right now. I think I'll finish with just a few remarks about Russian propaganda. It's very important that the Russian propagandist narrative since the beginning of the war has really changed. In the beginning, Putin was trying to preach, saying that he needs to denazify Ukraine and there are Nazis, and actually no one bought it. Like for most Russians, that sounded weird, and they have never used that word again. So he said that, and then they realized that it's not working. And none of them, Margarita Simonyan, Solovyov, Kislev, they never used it. They just dropped the idea of denazification of Ukraine, because it was no one believed that. And then they started testing other topics, and actually they found something people could believe, that that's not the war against Ukraine. That's the war against the West. That's the war against America. And Ukrainians, as usual, as Mazepa, they are traitors. So they have to be punished for their treacherous act. Yeah, we are fighting. We were attacked by America. We Russians were attacked by Americans. We are fighting against Americans. There is a proxy war. Okay, yeah, we don't need to denazify Ukrainians, but they are traitors, so it's okay that they are punished. And that's the new propagandist narrative that a lot of people do not agree with, but at least they understand it. And it's easier to get the fact that that's a war against America, not against Ukraine, because it contradicts the stereotype that why, if that's a war against Ukraine, why are we losing? We are losing because it's against America. Thank you.
That's really, really interesting. Okay, more reasons to read the book. Now let's open it up to the audience. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Kate, and I'm doing a master's here at the J School. So I have the following question. Thank you for the talk. I'll be very brief. There was this textbook of Vladimir Medinsky that came out a while ago, and I think a couple of us had a chance to look at it. So to what extent do you see the myths that you've now mentioned being replicated in this textbook? Thank you.
Let's collect another question. Another question? Okay. Maybe you can just, I don't know if you need the microphone. Yeah?
Hi, I'm Anton. I'm a high school student. I go to a school not far from here. Sort of to this point about how there's now new myths about Russian history being added to this textbook. There has been an increase in how this information has been delivered to students over the past years, from a Perichin narrowing down to one textbook that's now going to be distributed everywhere. Would you say there was a point ever when this Russian historical narrative was looking in the right direction, when there was diversification of the different views of Russian history? Thank you.
My name is Alexander. I'm a portfolio manager and I used to own a nightclub in Moscow, in pre-war Moscow. And my question is, the first one is really short. So is this book originally in English, or is it a translation from Russian? Because I couldn't find the Russian version. And the second one, you said that you are blaming yourself and your colleagues for like not doing enough. So do you think you could have prevented the war if you did enough, given the total censorship? Wasn't it Dosh that lost the license after you asked a historic question about the Leningrad blockade and in live TV? So do you really think, and what could have journalists or historians or whoever you mean by colleagues have done differently to prevent the war that is happening now? Thank you.
Hi, just a quick question on behalf of my mother. So you did an interview with Zelensky in March 2022 on Zoom. So in the first 20 minutes, he made a lot of mistakes in Russian talking to the journalists. He's confusing basic words like lekarstva he couldn't pronounce. He was asking aid. Was that symbolic and signaling to the Ukrainian audience that this is part of his transition, like the transformation like that you spoke of, or was this simple just slip-ups? Thank you.
Those questions, and then we'll continue. If I'm right, the first two questions were close to each other about history textbooks. Yeah, I love Medinsky's textbook. It's a masterpiece because it has nothing to do with history. It's not about history, and the fact that they are rewriting it online because Ramzan Kadyrov complained about it, and we were wrong, but it's so outrageous because obviously it's justifying Stalin. I've read the two parts about the 20th century, and it's so weird how they describe Stalin, and it's every time they kind of hint that all the victims of Stalin's purges were to blame because they were criminals. Yeah, they were enemies of the state, and yes, some of them were not, but most of them were. So you shouldn't be surprised that all of them were exterminated. So, and it's really weird. It's not a history textbook. But actually we know that's the way how Medinsky views history. He has written the series of his of the books named Myths About Russia, where he wrote, for example, that Ivan the Terrible was a great effective manager, and actually all the medieval kings were very cruel, and he was not the worst. He was just a victim of the European propaganda. They wanted to whitewash themselves, and that's why they spread dirt about him. So that's the way how Medinsky works. It's ironic that he has become the ghostwriter of Putin, and he is Putin's ghostwriter. So all the previous Putin's articles about Ukraine or about Poland were written by Medinsky and his team. So it's not about history; it's about the way how he could get like that. That's how Russian political system works. I call it collective Putin in my book All the Kremlin's Men, and the most important feature is that everyone tries to guess what the boss wants them to do. So probably that's not Medinsky's initiative. He's just trying to write something that that Putin would love. And yeah, that's the cursed child of that bromance between Putin and Medinsky is that ugly textbook. But I don't think that anyone takes it seriously. And I'm sure that for a lot of history school teachers, that's just like slap in the face. They must be insulted, because yeah, obviously since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the way how history was taught in schools, like mostly it was rather decent. I've already mentioned that unfortunately we have never touched the basis of Russian Empire, the ideological basis, but it was very transparent, at least about 20th century, about Stalin. And although most Russians are still sure that the Second World War started in 1941, because they just cannot believe that Soviet Union was Hitler's ally during the first years of the war. But still, mostly the way how history was taught for the last 30 years was not that outrageous. So I don't think that it would be easy to brainwash the whole population in that way. But yeah, we have seen the results of the 10 years of the severe propagandist campaign, because like the current campaign of glorification of Russian imperial might have started only 10 years ago, in 2012, after Bolotnaya, when Putin was so disillusioned in the middle class, in the pro-Western intelligentsia. So he decided to change his power base. He decided that he needs to talk to other people, to those who want to make Russia great again. And so that's the turning point of Russian historical policy, 2012. Speaking about Russian version and English version, actually, I consider both of them to be original, because I've written it in Russian, and actually I translated most of the book myself. And it's impossible to publish this book in Russia, and I know it because I spoke to my former publishers, to a lot of people in Russia who definitely want to publish this book, but unfortunately it violates not only the criminal code, but just the concept of what is crime in Russia today. And I'm already a foreign agent, so I'm afraid that's just the beginning. But we have created our own technological samizdat. We have invented the new way how we can distribute this book in Russia. The Russian version was published by me as a publisher, together with Medusa. That is not a book publisher as well, but they decided to start being a book publisher to distribute books that can never be published in the country digitally and for free. So Medusa's application that is very technologically advanced, and that can bypass all the blockings, and that can be read by Russians in Russia, now is going to be not only a news aggregator, not only a news media, but also some kind of Russian bulletproof Kindle. So it's going to be possible to read books prohibited in Russia in that application for free. So, and that's at the same time, the book is going to be published in traditional way, and is going to be sold in Russian bookstores outside of Russia. I had several book presentations in London and in Berlin, and I hope that in many countries, including America, it's going to be sold. But yeah, that's not a business. That's not a publishing business. We still don't know anything about that virtual Russia, about that dispersed nation. Like we know that more than 1.5 million people left Russia last year, and those people are everywhere in Germany and Israel and Armenia and Latvia and Lithuania and in America and in Kazakhstan. So it's hard to get together all those people and to sell books. Like selling books is not a business, but okay, it's our philanthropist experiment, and let's wait and see what's going to happen. Speaking about why I blame myself, let me compare. I don't like comparing political issues to personal arguments, but let me compare it to a person who is bullied and maybe beaten at the doorstep of the house, or just inside the building, and he or she is screaming and trying to knock the doors of his neighbors and to ring the bells, and like the hooligans are beating him and he's screaming when no one opens the door to help him. Yeah, probably they are busy, probably they are watching TV, probably they just they are asleep, but they are not helping. They don't even think that it's a bad thing to do. Okay, maybe there is a husband beating his wife, and he has right to do that, they might think. But we know the fact that we, as Russian intellectuals, we have been witnessing that hostile, aggressive narrative against Ukrainians, and we tolerated it. We turned blind eye. I know that for many years, I myself had several arguments with my Ukrainian friends and colleagues, and I was trying to prove them that it's such a great thing that we have the common language, that so many Ukrainians speak Russian, and you should not. It's not really civilized to try to promote Ukrainian language. You need to respect the rights of the Russian-speaking minority. That's the way how the European nation should behave. But actually, I didn't want to hear their approach. I didn't know anything about the history of the extermination of Ukrainian cultural elite. I have never heard about the executed Renaissance in the 30s that happened exactly the same year as Holodomor happened. I didn't know a lot. I didn't want to know and to listen to their pains. And am I to blame myself for that? I think I should. Because if I knew that, if I started thinking about that, my approach might have been different. Definitely would have been different. Everything I said and wrote must have been different. And yeah, it's I blame myself for that. It's not a question about did we have a chance to overthrow Putin with our TV channel? That's completely different question. Yeah, probably we were. I may blame myself for being too naive in 2012, because yeah, I was really thinking and I was persuading my colleagues that I thought that we were prevailing. I thought that that's such a huge wave, and so many people are supporting us. Russian middle class stood up against Putin. No one wants him back. He is doomed. It's a matter of time. I was stupid and naive, as many of us. And that's another issue. That's another question. But when we're speaking about Ukraine, I definitely should have been more careful, more attentive. Like you should listen to those people who are in pain. You should not impose your point of view, and like that's gaslighting. Speaking about Zelensky and his Russian, I don't think that he made a lot of mistakes speaking Russian. He deliberately, that was the first time for him when he gave interview in Russian for months at least, and some people say deliberately, couple of times, asked his assistant, how is it in Russian, as if he forgotten the word in Russian. And knowing that he started learning Ukrainian in 2018, 1 year before he ran for presidency, that could seem unlikely. But at the same time, I gave 50 interviews about this book in English, and yesterday I was giving the first interview in Russian about it to Medusa, and I found it really weird to speak it in Russian because I don't know all those words. I know I've been thinking about all that problematic for so many months only in English. I don't have that phraseology. So for me, it was very hard to formulate the same thoughts in Russian, although that's my mother tongue, not English. So, and the same with Zelensky. He was speaking to his people. He was speaking again and again about the war, about aggression in Ukraine, and for so many in Ukraine for so many months. It's normal that he could have forgotten a Russian word. I don't think that he was acting, but even if he was acting, that was okay. Yeah, he wants to convince. Actually, he didn't need that time. That was end of March. He has already become the true hero, the superhero for all Ukrainians. He didn't need to persuade them that he can speak Ukrainian better than Russian. Another round of questions.
Hi, thank you so much for being here, and thank you the Institute for such a great event. And my question, first of all, I'm so proud to speak with a foreign agent, and I think this is like a great list of great people. Yeah, my name is Wasoy. It's just the sales just started here. It's pretty popular here, the hat. So my question is, my question, excuse me, it will be pretty naive, and the same time, the question I ask myself every day: when do you think and how the war will end? What do you think about it? That's it. Thank you.
Mikhail, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I'm Kirill. I'm a second-year PhD student here at Columbia, and I think that's a very timely manner that we talk about different myths. And at the same time, we know that in Ukraine, for instance, this is a huge success of civil society, that they actually managed to debunk a lot of this and think about like how to, resurrect identity symbols like language, state symbols, and culture. So my question, I guess, is, do you think it's possible to replicate this sort of success in post-war society in Russia? Because imagine we basically have the society of losers, right? We all know that Russia will eventually lose the war. And I guess the question is that when we get rid of all of these myths, how Russia is dependent on all of these identities, what are we left with, right? So what do we want people to believe in? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Anastasia. I'm a journalist Russian journalist, but working here. I wanted to ask, when you said after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian intellectuals were mostly busy with like working on Stalin and this like Gulag history and these kind of things, don't you think that unfortunately that still was not achieved, like fully immersed in that international history? And if that would be, that again, things could have been different. And as your book is kind of an effort for like a decolonization discourse, I would say, what do you think is the role of Russian intellectuals? And isn't it more stepping down or like stepping away and letting the other peoples who were like are living in Russia or were living in the Soviet Union speak up and include their voices into the narrative? Or what do you think should be the role of intellectuals? Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Vadim Perfilev from United Nations. Are you still advising Dost TV? Do you kind of appreciate what they are doing now? Or would you tell that they would do something differently? So what is your opinion about Dost working now from Netherlands? Thank you.
Are you planning, excuse me, are you planning a meeting and your book presentation to Russians and Ukrainian immigrants in New York City? You planning any meetings or?
Thank you for your questions. I know the day when the war is going to end. Precisely. That's the day when Putin is going to die. Yeah, I think that's like, and at least I know for sure that the war is not going to end while he's alive, because he needs this war. He's not going to stop it. He's not going to, like, he doesn't want any peace. He doesn't want any truce. He doesn't want any negotiations. Okay, he wants negotiations as the opportunity to save time to strike again. So he wants the war. He needs the war to remain in power. So, and I do believe that collective Putin, that all the people surrounding him, we have seen them on that terrible video made on February 21st, when the Security Council was trying to guess what he wants them to say, and they were wrong, especially the head of Russian intelligence. So for them, the war is a catastrophe. And probably is going to be inertia after his death. It's impossible to bring back the peaceful and prosperous the happy 2021. But still, I believe that they don't want this war, and the war as we see it now is going to be over after he's dead. But he's healthy. We know that all those rumors about his shaken health, they are wrong. Next year he's going to be elected for his first presidential term. Thanks to Valentina Tereshkova, it's going to be the first one, so he could be re-elected. So in 6 years, he's going to be still 77, a young age for an American politician. Yeah. So speaking about the post-war Russian society, I probably should not. I should start with the fact that we still don't know when this post-war society is going to emerge, because we can have this war for 10 years, and that would mean that the brainwashed, depressed, horrified people would be different. They are not going to be the same. I believe that majority of Russians do not support this war. If they supported the war, probably last year we should have seen a lot of volunteers trying to go to the front line, not Mr. Prigozhin trying to recruit prisoners. And this year we won't see the Putin paying 200,000 rubles for any volunteer, which is a fortune for any depressive region. But in 10 years, in 5 years, what's going to happen with the mentality of that majority of Russians? Now they are scared. Now they don't want to think about the war. Now they prefer to pretend that there is no war, and that's safer. And by the way, speaking about Dorscht, according to the statistics of most independent Russian media, the average quantity of Russians watching immigrant independent media is from 13 to 20 million people. At least 13, but as Russians are using VPN, it could be up to 20 million. That is more than 10% of the population. That is already, I think, not bad, because to watch all those immigrant media while living in Russia, that means to hurt yourself on a daily basis. That means like to torture yourself and to remind yourself that you are living in a fascist country and you are kind of, if not an accomplice, but you are, you have to tolerate it. So it's really psychologically, it's very hard for any Russian who remains there to keep an eye on the news and to read it on a day or to watch it on a daily basis. At least more than or about 10% of the population have courage to do that. And we don't know what's going to happen with the rest of the people. So it's going to be very hard for the post-war. I'm optimistic. I think that there is no way out. So I believe that this war is going to be fatal for Russian imperialism and for imperial national pride. It's not going to be possible to be proud of the glorious Russian weapon and glorious Russian army after this war. So I think that's the end. But it's going to be hard. And answering your question, what to believe in, I can just tell you the short story from my book called "The Empire Must Die." When Nicholas II did want to sign the manifesto of 1905, and he didn't want a constitution to emerge in Russia, but he was persuaded by his prime minister Count Witte, because Witte has written a thick report about a history of Russian people fighting for its freedom, and he created specific for one reader another historical narrative that started from Novgorod Republic, and he described all the history of Russia through that lens, showing that all and like his most important idea was that actually the autocracy, the Russian Tsardom was only 2 or 3 centuries by that time, but Russian people fighting for their freedom, that was from the beginning of the history. That's the traditional, like freedom is the traditional value, Witte said, not autocracy, not the sacred Russian Empire. So I guess it's still possible to find the same arguments and the same historical examples, as Witte has done that already once. Speaking about Stalin, yeah, I agree. And we know all that. We know that a lot of mistakes, not in terms of history, but like, unfortunately, 90s is the decade of lost chances. We had a lot of chances to change Russian society. There was a possibility and necessity to open the archives, and they are closed. They were closed soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was not only about history; it was about the democratic institutions. Unfortunately, the people who are considered to be Russian Democrats, they screwed it. They destroyed the possibility to believe in democratic in the press freedom, in elections, in the electoral campaign of 1996. Re-election of President Yeltsin was a shame, and that was the moment when Russian democracy was destroyed. It was not Putin. It was Yeltsin's family. So yeah, a lot of mistakes were made, and yes, actually we must have treated our history as our current political situation in a different way. I'm not sure I understood correctly the question about the decolonization. If I think that we Russians need to shut up and be silent for a period of time and let others speak, I'm not sure. I think that every person should heal his or her own diseases, and I guess that Ukrainians should care about their country and their history and their society. I guess that Tatars or Buryats or other peoples of Russia should be more active, and we should give floor to them. Belarusians should be more active, and we should listen to their voices and to their stories more carefully and more attentively. But they won't heal Russians. So I think unfortunately, our history and our crimes, our past, brought us to this war. So they won't be able to heal Russian society. That's our mission. So I don't think that we'd better shut up. I think we'd better speak up, but in a new way. I'm not affiliated with Dost right now, although I'm they are my family. I'm a godfather of the little son of the current editor-in-chief and his wife, who is the main news presenter, and coincidentally their son is called Misha. So they are very close friends of mine. I have no influence to their policy. I have no moral right to criticize them because it's really hard for them. They had to leave Russia. Most of them went to Istanbul or Tbilisi. Then they had to leave Istanbul and Tbilisi and moved to Riga. Then they got the license there and started working. Then they lost their license there and had to leave Riga and relocate to Amsterdam. They got the license in the Netherlands exactly the same moment when they were packing their suitcases traveling from Riga to Amsterdam. They were declared undesirable organization in Russia, which means that any viewer who is watching them and, let's say, tries to repost their video on in the social media, he could be sent to jail up to 7 years. So that's like, and every undesirable organization like Dost or Meduza have to urge their viewers, please never say anyone that you are watching us. Stop sharing our posts. no, don't do that. That's insane behavior for media. That's the only way to save your audience, to save the people who are watching you. So it's really hard for them. I know I was running that TV channel for several years, including in 2014 when the Crimea occupation happened, and I know, and when it was almost destroyed by Russian authorities, I know how hard it is to maintain optimism in your journalists, because if journalists have nothing but bitter feelings of depression and anxiety, and they see no perspective and no meaning of their work, they cannot work. So it's really hard for any independent media that now has to work from the exile. But I think that it's obvious that, at least according to the statistics, they are needed. They are still influential. They are still the most important independent media in Russia. Like Meduza or Dost, probably those two households, and all of them are my dear friends, but I'm not working there. And I think the last question was about my plans about the presentation of Russian version of my book. I plan it. It's going to happen. The official release date of the Russian version is October 24th. It's going to be available on Amazon and in Meduza application in many bookstores. I don't have the data about the bookstores in New York City, but as I live here, it's going to be easier for me to organize anything here, because yes, now I live in New York. I don't live in Europe anymore, so I guess that I'll be very active with my Russians, very careful with my Russian speaking audience in America. I won't let you down. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. On that note, we again welcome you to New York and to our community, and we're so grateful for your excellent book and this wide-ranging discussion in response to all of these really interesting questions. So let's thank our speakers.